Mr. Finch, welcome to Mediabox. So you are a migration expert in UK and you're coming from UK. And this morning you took a part in a meeting of the No Hate Parliamentary Alliance, which held a hearing on refugees not welcome. So it's important because you underlined that if we really welcome refugees or not welcome refugees. So from starting that point, how would you describe the political reactions of the refugees of the European countries?
Well, I think the fact of the matter is that it's not been consistent. So it's neither been refugees not welcome or welcome. It's veered around a bit. And even within individual countries, there have been signals occasionally that, yes, we recognise the scale of the crisis, particularly emanating from Syria, and that we need to welcome people in, and various regulations that you have usually applied to people coming into Europe have been suspended or relaxed. And then at other times there have been signals the other way saying, well, now the movements are uncontrolled and they're so big we can't cope with them. So borders have gone up and they've come down, signals have been sent that refugees are welcome and then that they're not so welcome. So it's a very, very mixed message. And one of my concerns is, well, one, I don't think you can't carry on having a system of refugee protection that works in this way. It just isn't long-term and sustainable. And the other is that it sends very, very mixed messages to European publics who understandably are going to be a bit concerned about the numbers of people coming over. But what they really want to feel is that their governments are in control and they know what they're doing. And the way governments have responded, understandable as it is in some ways, it hasn't helped that situation.
And in all European countries, we see different policies and different approaches that you mentioned. So what are your recommendations on that point? So is it possible to have a common values or common policies on refugee crisis? What should European countries do more?
Well, it would clearly be useful if there was some European solidarity on this. The countries of the EU, the 27, and for that matter Europe, the wider continent, was able to cooperate more on this. If they did that, then everyone would benefit from it. But I understand, there are different political issues. After all, there are governments of different political stripes in different places. Some of them have been elected to be tough on immigration. Some of them haven't been. So it is difficult. But I do feel as though the only way forward on this is European cooperation, or you have what you have now, which is effectively what we call in Britain beggar my neighbour policies, where what you try and do is you try and react in such a way that you have to do the least so that somebody else has to do more. And that's incredibly unfair. And in the end, countries, if you do that to one country, then they'll start doing it back to you. And we've seen a situation a bit like that with the standoff in Calais at the moment. In my own view, the way forward on this is we've got to rethink how we provide refugee protection in Europe much more fundamentally than we do currently. The major problem with the way refugees come to Europe and get safety here is that they have to use irregular routes. There are no legal routes to claim asylum in most European countries, so people are forced to take these journeys in unsafe boats across the Mediterranean, or try and come up through the Balkans on foot, or be smuggled, or use false passports, because otherwise they just cannot get here. And that's why I think we should move to a system of managed refugee protection, where Europe reaches out to refugees where they largely are, in camps or in countries like Lebanon and Jordan, for instance, with the Syrian crisis, and actively bring them into the country. That of course, if you had that system and it worked perfectly, and of course it never would in an ideal world, but it worked better, that would work for refugees. But then there's people who don't qualify as refugees, who don't have the same pressing human rights needs that refugees do, but for instance low-skilled economic migrants from sub-Saharan Africa largely wouldn't qualify as refugees under the convention, but there's still an issue around them, and a lot of them desperately trying to come to Britain and other parts of Europe. So in those situations, I think we've got to look again at, are there ways in which you can create legal routes for low-skilled migration into the EU, because if you solve the refugee part but you don't solve the low-skilled economic part, then you'll still have a great deal of pressure on Europe's borders.
Thank you for all this clear message. So thank you, Mr. Finch.